I will request Ms. Richa Agarwal, Chairperson of KCC, to please come up and say a few words.
A very good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here at KCC. I know these times are very difficult and there's so much happening in the city. So, for all of you all who have taken out a little bit more time to be here with us, we stand with what's happened in the city. It's painful, it's hurtful, and I pray that we can do whatever we can and whatever it takes. Um, Kolkata Center for Creativity is an initiative by the Imami Group of Companies, and it was started by just love for art or sheer passion by Mr. R.S. Agarwal and Mr. R.S. Goenka. Uh, our programming is very versatile. We do a lot of programming on arts and culture, and we work a lot in collaborations because we understand that that's the way forward. So when Ambika suggested that Kaee Contemporary and we should do this talk together, who would not want to work with Ambika? So quite obviously we had to do it here. So thank you for being here today, and thank you so much for being a part of this evening. I'm sure we normally like to start things on time, and hence we're not going to be able to wait too much for others to join. They'll join us as and when. We will have a recording of whatever is being said. So at any point in time, anyone wants to share the talk, we'd be happy to, with your permission, of course, Ambika. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I will begin by introducing today's speaker. Premjish Achari is a curator, writer, and filmmaker. He was editorial supervisor of The World is One Family 2021, a major contemporary art survey exhibition. He was a recipient of the Pro Helvetia Art Writers Award 2021 and has published Lure of Collaboration, dissecting consensus for Take on Art. He is currently editing the first issue of the inaugural English art magazine for Kerala Lalita Kala Academy. He has conceptualized and initiated the Kaee Kolkata City Lab and has directed The Other Faces, a film on the artist Ravinder Reddy. Handing it over to Mr. Achari. Please come on stage.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Before I begin, as Richard said, that we are going through a tough time, and we are mourning a great loss, a tragic loss that has shook us all. And I also take this opportunity to pay our condolences on behalf of the family, on behalf of all of us, to the family, the bereaved, who who's going through a tough time, and the city has come together in their anguish, in their support, to mourn the loss, but also to seek answers about that loss. Uh, Thank you, Richa, for hosting, and it's been a great pleasure to be here. That is one of the important cultural centers of India itself. It's very rare that we have a full-fledged facility that is offered to the versatility of art of our times. And one can see that in this space that is divided into various facets, offering space, hosting exhibitions, theater, talks, academic programs, and also space for research through libraries and various other prospects. So I'm happy to be here and happy to be part of this city, to be here, and thank you, Ambika, for inviting me to initiate the Kaee Kolkata City Lab. I would urge all of you, request all of you to visit the exhibition that is going on at the Kaee Contemporary Gallery in Alipur. Please see, because the exhibition is related to the various aspects of the city. The exhibition is related to the history, the memory, the archives, the culinary practices, the lives of the laboring class, the ecological crisis, aspects related to memory, the water bodies, the various ways in which the exhibition enters into what is Kolkata and how what we see as Kolkata, the lived spaces and the built spaces of Kolkata. And like yesterday, we had a discussion, and the important thing about the exhibition is that it enters all through all of this questions through a contemporary perspective. A contemporary perspective of how to do research with the city, not only on the city, but with the city. So we have two lectures today, and they're like very short times because earlier the lectures used like the way we had planned it. It used to be around 2 hours. It has been much condensed, and to maintain some kind of connectivity, I'm flipping the lectures. I will start with psychogeography, and then enter into the part where we will deal with building inclusive communities in the city, and there will be a certain connection. So I see it as one lecture. That's how I have developed it. uh, so it won't be exactly in that two parts, but we will also keep check of the time, because we have to also finish it in the given stipulated time that's there. But before I get into the lecture, I would like to start doing an exercise which I also did in the previous lecture. So those who have attended the first lecture, they will remember that. But this is also for those who have not attended the previous lectures, to get into an understanding of where our positions are coming from, and why this urgency to address the urban crisis, and what art and image making practices can do to the current crisis in urbanism. This is not my exercise. This is an exercise by a very famous art historian theorist called Nicholas Mirzov, who has extensively written on images and image studies. So what you must have seen this image. It's a very popular image. This image is known as the blue marble. It's a very famous image of the Earth, and it's actually one of the first images of Earth from outside Earth, from the space. So in 1972, this was taken in 1972, the astronaut Jack Schmitt took a picture of Earth from the Apollo 17 spacecraft, which is now believed to be the most reproduced photograph ever. So it also has that credit that it's been the most reproduced photograph in the human history. And because it showed the spherical globe dominated by blue oceans with intervening green land masses and swirling clouds, the image came to be known as blue marble. The photograph powerfully depicted the planet as a whole, and from space, no human activity or presence was visible. It appeared on almost every newspaper front page around the world. The poet Archibald MacLeish recalled that for the first time, people saw the earth as a whole and round, and beautiful and small. Some found spiritual and environmental lessons in viewing the planet as if from a place of a god. Writer Robert Poole called Blue Marble a photographic manifesto for global justice. Coming to 2012, this is another blue marble. This is the blue marble of 2012, from 1972 to 2012. And this is a digitally enhanced image that has been made by NASA. Could anybody spot any difference between these two images? Any guess? This highlights a lot of details, geographic details and everything. Yes, it does. And it highlights something very particular too. Yes, that also it does. But it highlights something very important geopolitical position. That is of the United States, that all the other continents have gone, like it positions United States of America as the center of the earth, as an important continent of the earth, compared to the previous image, which was about the entire world, entire planet, entire globe. So this is what images can also do. Images are not that simple. Images are powerful. It creates this ideological dimension to it. But what I also wanted to do is to take this journey, which Nicholas Mirzov also talks about, from 1972 to 2012. And Mirzov presents four key registers for us to understand that this image changed from 1972 to 2012. But there are four key things that also changed in the world, especially in four key registers. Today, the world is young, it's urban, it's wired or wireless, and it's hot. It's extremely hot. We know that. We know the perils of that global warming, the climate crisis we are facing. And each of these indicators has passed a crucial threshold since 2008. That's very important for us to understand. So most of the world population at that time, right now, it's young, which is an important indicator. And by 2011, more than half of the world's population was under 30. 62% of Brazilians are 29 or younger. More than half of the 1.2 billion Indians are under 25, and a similar young majority exists in China. Two-thirds of South Africa's population is under 35. And according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, 52% of the 18 million people in Nigeria are under 15, and most of sub-Saharan Africa. The populations of North America, Western Europe, and Japan may be aging, but the global pattern is very clear. It's a young global population that is emerging. And the third threshold, which I also want to talk about, is I'll come to this. Sorry, the image is not there, but it's about connectivity, and which is something very important that in 2015, 45% of the world's population had some kind of access to the internet, up 806% in 2006. And it's not just Europe and America that are connected. 45% of those with internet access are in Asia. Nonetheless, the major regions that lack connections are sub-Saharan Africa other than South, and also the Indian subcontinent. There's a great global divide at a global level, digital divide. And by the end of 2014, it was estimated that 3 billion people were online, and it's more now. By the end of the decade, it was predicted that Google envisages 5 billion people on the internet, and I'm sure it will be more than that. And this is not just another form of mass media, it is the first universal medium that connects all of us together, that connects us creatively, politically, and socially. The planet itself is changing before our eyes. In 2013, the carbon dioxide passed the signature threshold of 400 parts per million in the atmosphere for the first time since the Pliocene era about 3 to 5 million years ago. Although we cannot see the gas, it has set in motion catastrophic change. With more carbon dioxide, warm air holds more water vapor. As the ice caps melt, there is more water in the ocean. As the oceans warm, there is more energy for a storm system to draw on, producing storm after unprecedented storm. If a hurricane or earthquake creates what scientists call a high sea level event, like a storm surge or tsunami, the effects are dramatically multiplied. So this is a key change. And now I come to the cities. That's the crucial attention of today. That's an important factor for all of us. In 1972, when we looked at the blue marble, more people lived in cities than the countryside for the first time in history. Consider the emerging world power Brazil. In 1960, only a third of its people lived in city. By 1972, when blue marble was taken, the urban population had already passed 50%. Today, 85% of Brazilians live in cities, no less than 166 million people. Just showing this for your kind of substitute information. You can take a look at the slides. If you look at the statistics provided by United Nations, it is expected that the global urbanization level will increase to 40% by 2050. It would be extremely difficult for developing nations to cope with this situation. Most importantly, it appears that these urbanization processes and the resulting cities will not accommodate the urban poor, pushing them ever more to the margins without no or limited access to the resources that a city offers. As of now, over 1 billion people live in slums or other kinds of informal housing systems globally. This is estimated to grow by 1.4 billion in 2020. And the situation is not different in India, particularly Delhi. Drawing on the data available from United Nations, the architectural and design scholar Alpana Shivam highlights the urgency that we face. According to her, the current method of informal housing is not the answer to accommodate the growing urban poor population in Delhi. If government will not seek for alternatives, Delhi's street dweller population will increase. Without digressing into the details of the various programs which may have been launched by the government to alleviate the disparity, it is sufficient to note that these have been largely unsuccessful. So as you can see, the gravity of the situation from 1917 to 2012, and especially in the case of cities, urbanism and urban planning. And that was a crucial concern for Kaee, art and the city. It's a city lab. It's conceived as a project that aims to question and also offer not solutions but propositions to build better cities, to build sensitive cities, to build inclusive cities. This was our attempt, and all of us have propositions for that. And it's a work in progress exhibition in that relation. This was the first lecture which I gave, and the lecture was basically about the right to the city, inspired by Henry Lefebvre's famous proposition and book, The Right to the City. What is the right to the city? And we get various visions. There are various documents that are shared, visions, reports that are prepared for all of us, smart city reports, inclusive city reports, manifestos, vision documents, and everything shared around the world. This is part of the new urban agenda. And this was also discussed critically in the lecture. But what I meant by the right to the city is not only in terms of access to the city. It's not about that we have access to all parts of the city, that we can move around the city. That was not only the right to the city. The right to the city was about the right in participation, the right to participation in the governing aspects of the city. That every citizen of the city has the right to decide or can voice out their dreams, aspirations, and visions toward what kind of cities they want. They could take part in the solutions of all kinds of crises we are facing. And the second right is the right to appropriate urban environment. So the right to city for me is not just some kind of abstract right or some kind of romanticized right that can only be used as a term in urbanism and urban planning, but it is, for me, it is more similar to what we also what we also understand as human rights. It should be made important and mandatory for that. And for that, to have this understanding about the city, to claim the city, to take part in the city, participate not only in terms of living in the city, but to be part of the city in terms of its governance, administration. We also need to understand how do we own a city, which part of it is claimed by whom, and what are the criteria of owning a city. And it's not an exact answer, but David Harvey, who has also extensively written on city, urban planning, urbanism, and also Marxist economy, capital, and all. He says that the answer depends on what kind of people we want to be. It's not about the cities, it's about what kind of people we want to be, then the city will emerge from that vision. We have to first decide what kind of people we want to be, what kind of social relations we want to build around each other, and what relations to nature we cherish. What is our relation to the ecology? What is our relation to the surroundings? Is it respectful? It is exploitative? It is preservative? It's conservational? What kind of relations do we want to build with the ecology? What style of daily life we desire? What kind of technologies we deem appropriate, and what aesthetic values we hold? These are the important parameters in shaping up what kind of cities we want to build, what kind of cities we desire. So this was the first lecture. I'm just doing a quick recap for those who could not join. And this was the second lecture, which made an important shift in conceptual understanding about placemaking. So artists are usually seen as art makers. So our idea for the project and generally for my proposition in the lecture was we need to make an important shift from art making to placemaking. Because in contemporary global capitalism, what we are seeing is a production of spaces, empty spaces, hollow spaces, smart city, whatever we call them, but spaces that are able to live but not to call as place, not to call as home. So how do we call, how do we turn a space into a place that we can call as home, that we can belong to? And if that has to happen, so we engaged in detail with this project called Project for Public Places, Spaces. And their critique is this: if you plan cities for cars and traffic, you get cars and traffic. If you plan for people and places, then you get people and places. So you need to plan your cities accordingly based on the vision which you want to develop the cities. And it also delved into certain conceptual aspects of the various terms we use to denote geography, space, place. What are the conceptual, minute distinctions between these terms? We looked at also various examples from the indigenous tribes, that how do they look at space? How do they understand place? How do they understand directions? Because in certain languages there is no north, east, west, south. They denote directions through certain movement of the wind, certain sounds that come from that side. So the universal homogeneous idea of space does not exist everywhere. So it's also important for us to, when we are entering into these projects, to understand what kind of categories form when we are talking about geography and space. So this was a brief of the first two lectures. And before I enter into the lecture, I also want to give you a brief overview about the crucial relation with art and architecture. And when they were together and when they diverge from each other. Because to give you a very popular example, Da Vinci. Now, as all of you know, that Da Vinci was not only a painter, he was an architect also. He was an engineer. He was an innovator. And then apart from that, he was a wonderful draftsman, painter, and all that. And what they were building were not only paintings or murals, they were also building the architecture that could relate, or the artworks that could relate with the architecture. And this is the same case with most of the pre-modern architecture system around the world. Even in India, if you look at the mosques, the temples, all the places of religious worships and houses too, it synchronized art and architecture together. So there is a coexistence of art and architecture. They are not seen separate from each other in historical time. And so art has been a crucial part of city building for centuries, for thousands of years. And it is serving as a tangible system for urban society. It is only now that we think of art as an afterthought when we build cities. That, oh, we need a public art festival, or we need to beautify our cities, then we need art. There's no thought of art integrated with urban planning from the beginning itself. But in the past, art was primarily seen through civic monuments and religious structures like churches and cathedrals. That's where people could go and see artworks. That's where they used to go and see all those big murals, big sculptures, whether they were bowing down to it, they were contemplating, meditating, that was different. But that's where they saw images in such huge magnitude, such impressive quality. So these artworks were also funded by cities and their citizens, and they served as media for conveying political, economic, and social values. Artistic contributions to urban planning was interpreted as civic aesthetics or embellishments. So since modern times, what we call as the word urban comes from the root urb, URB, which means the material city. So up to modern times, the urb has been shaped by the civitas. Civitas is the community, the civic community. So the community with urban space design being a holistic practice that included various art forms like painting, sculpture, architecture, and urban planning. This integration made urban life, history, and thoughts legible to inhabitants, fostering a sense of representation and responsibility. So, civic aesthetics was characterized by an instinctive use of visual arts and design in urban planning, viewing the city as a comprehensive object of intervention, valuing beauty as an end. The recognition of individual identity within the collective civitas was tied to beauty as urban transformations turned streets and squares into living spaces. This relationship thrived on the common educational paths of artists and architects who were trained together in art academies, or sometimes they performed all these roles together. However, during the Industrial Revolution, the relationship between art and architecture, and therefore art and the city diminished, it weakened. The division of knowledge, what happened was that with the arrival of new technologies, new materials, this division of knowledge led to the engineers and architects taking over city construction with the development in technologies and relegating art to something of a decorative nature. That art is not required. We need to celebrate and showcase the technology itself, the technology of engineering itself. And most of the modern architecture, especially the huge towers, are an example of those engineering prowess. Starting with Eiffel Tower, for example, it starts as an iconic example of the engineering prowess of that time. That itself is enough to show the world, show the civic community that we only need this. So this shift in the relationship between art and architecture during the industrial era can be attributed to several factors. Initially, art and architecture diverged due to the advancements in material and technology, such as the use of concrete, leading to industrialized architecture and standardization. And this shifted architecture towards engineering and making it separate from the art field. So what existed together, art and architecture, started separating from each other. And now the distance is very huge apart. Even as disciplines in academic centers too, there's a huge difference that it's very rare that architects study art history, architect gets involved in, there are very few architecture institutions in India that encourage that kind of integrated learning of art and architecture. So, by late modernity, the influence of public spaces on civic representation diminished, and the paradigm of civic aesthetics gave way to urban decoration, focusing on the aestheticization of public spaces. So that became the task of all the governments, that you build the city and then you try to beautify certain parts by putting sculptures or doing some wall street art or things like that. And as a result, what happened is that the art lost their roles as directors of urban design. Earlier, these seminal figures who were integral and who had this integrated knowledge of art, architecture, design, and everything, slowly started separating into several different disciplines. And what happened that they lost their capacity, especially artists lost their capacity to intervene in urban design. And they became autonomous disciplines in themselves. And this also severed the historical connection between architecture and urban planning. The long-standing integration of functionality and aesthetics, which characterized the art and architecture partnership, collapsed, leading to a disjointed relationship between art and the city. So when art pursued aesthetics, architecture pursued utility. Painting and sculpture found new patrons among the burgeoning commercial bourgeoisie, becoming status symbols displayed in private homes. Over time, when private collecting decreased, museums and galleries began showcasing artworks. Architecture, aligning more with engineering, became heavily technique focused, and the link between the arts and urban design was reduced. So art became an afterthought in urban spaces, included primarily to soften architectural lines post design and construction. So this is a dense relationship that doesn't end with modernity. And later on, many avant-garde artists promoted a real stylistic update where there was a total rejection of the academic tradition in favor of conception of art as free from the needs of symbolic and allegorical celebrations. In particular, since the 50s, artists seek a new relationship with the city and the urban area, and they started interacting with the environment, abandoning purely decorative or ceremonial purposes that were ascribed to them. Over the past 20 years, art started addressing the issues of urban regeneration. And the latter is conceived not only in terms of aesthetic appreciation of the building environment, but rather as a general reflection of the quality of citizens' lives and on inhabitants' relationship with the urban space. Art now returns to play a primary role in designing the city, and artists are more and more asked to use their sensitivity in order to transform spaces into places. So I get into the main engagement today that is about emotional topography, mapping the soul of the city. And so what is emotional topography? And yesterday also we had this discussion about mapping the city. Emotional topography is an emerging proposition within the urban studies because topography, as you know, is about mapping. It's about the lay of the land, and cartography represents that lay of the land. And cartography is believed to be the rational way to map the surface. But is cartography the only way to map the surface? Is cartography enough to represent the city? Does it represent the city adequately and represent the diversity and versatility of the city? So emotional topography is something, a concept that is developed by psychogeographists. I will come to that, what is psychogeography later on. It invites us to engage with cities through the lens of emotions, rather than just through geographical or cartographical data. And while traditional cartography relies on empirical data, or they use rationality to look at urban spaces, emotional topography emphasizes on the subjective experience that you are walking through the city and what are you feeling about it? What are the emotions you are going through it? What are the experiences you are facing when you enter the city? And this is not a new thing, like even in the 19th century when cities were developing, the European flaneurs were documenting the shock they had when the cities started growing. The traffic was huge. When they encountered these growing cities and the burgeoning crowds around them, the initial experience was of shock, and most of the writers wrote about this experience. So emotional topography is documenting subjective experiences of what one feels and experience in the city. And they approach acknowledges that this approach acknowledges that cities are not just physical entities, but also dynamic emotional landscapes that are shaped by the interactions, memories, and feelings of their inhabitants. And this is different from rational cartography. Rational cartography, as I said, it traditionally focuses on objective data. Like it looks at geographical coordinates, zoning boundaries, infrastructure layouts to represent urban spaces. And this form of mapping is important. I'm not saying it's not important. It's important for urban planning. Like Shalina has, in our exhibition, Shalina has shown the early maps, the 19th century maps and all, how the city was clustered into different zones and everything. So it's important for planning, navigation and everything, but it's also often overlooks the subjective experience, the human experience that gives cities their unique character. In contrast, emotional topography prioritizes the lived experiences and emotional connections people form with their environments. So it invites us to ask not only where is this place, but it also invites us to ask, how does this place make us feel? And this is something we really undermine, that cities also have huge impact on our emotions, our feelings and experiences. And it challenges the objectivity of cartography by acknowledging that the significance of urban spaces often transcends their physical attributes. Like making a painting, making a map is also traditionally associated with representation. It's a desire to see the place. Like, how does my place look? It's what you are trying to see. How does my city look? How does my country look? That's what map is also trying to fulfill. Cartography is trying to fulfill. It's a desire to know and grasp the entire city or the nation in its totality. But it does not look at the city through its micro worlds. It does not understand or represent the city through the various ways in which it is inhabited and lived through. So it's about, the maps are about the desire to seeing the city rather than understanding these micro worlds that exist in the city. And so mapping in this traditional sense is associated with spatial practices, clustering, dividing. It's representing the world. So map is a picture of reality, but it's a representation of the Earth's surface, a real, neutral, objective representation, just like a photograph. A picture of an apple describes an apple. Is it right or wrong? A picture of an apple describes an apple. Is it right or wrong? What do you think? A picture of an apple, does it represent or describe the apple? Does? Oh, yes. It can, it, yes, all right, like it has all these possibilities, but not in its entirety. Not in its entirety. It cannot describe the apple in its entirety. Like that, the map cannot describe the place in its entirety. Any representation of the world or a place that asserts its neutrality and objectivity is immediately, it has to be suspected, because representations, pictures, descriptions must be considered in the light of their production and the politics of power about how it is represented. Whose apple, whose map, and whose city? Is this city, does this city belong to me? We need to ask this question. So making art, like making maps, is about making a selection from the complexity of the world, choosing to highlight certain things while other things go unnoticed. So this is where I come to a very important art movement of France that has played a huge, that has been very impactful on various urban practices for decades across the world. Starting from the late 50s onwards and 60s, it was very dominant, and 70s too, and then in between it had a kind of dull phase, but then it's a movement that is revived again and again, been dead again and again, but has a huge impact on urban practices and especially views on urbanism. That is the Situationist International in France. And they were really dumbstruck by the modern Paris. They were really bothered by how the modern Paris was designed. And Guy Debord, whose quote I have mentioned here, he's talking about what is psychogeography. So according to Guy Debord, it is a study of the precise laws and specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organized or not, on the emotions and behavior of individuals. So here, in spite of the community, the larger, instead of the larger good, here the focus is on how the larger spaces around us impact the individual, how it affects their behavior, how it governs their behavior, how it controls them. And every movement in the city, how it is planned by the planning, the great planning, is not neutral. It is serving a function to govern, administer, and control too. And that is what the situation is very interesting in observing, that how it is shaping our experiences, how it is controlling our emotions, or how it is shaping our emotions. So they were very dumbstruck by, as I said earlier, by the modern Paris. And Debord was inspired by, he kind of rephrased, taking inspiration from Macbeth. And in his speech, he looked at the critique of the city that is spectacular. It's amazing in scale, it's growing in scale, it's huge, it's lofty. But he said that city is existing with a sense of tragedy. And so tragedy is this: from any standpoint other than that of police control, Haussmann's Paris is a city built by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. This is what Debord had to say about Paris, the modern Paris. And other situationists, it's a larger group. So Attila Kotania and Raoul Vanhagen, They described more recent attempts at urbanism and these associated spectacles as nothingness. So, urbanism is comparable to the advertisement propaganda around Coca Cola. That is pure spectacular ideology. And they looked at various case studies to engage with how cities are about spectacles, about experiences that the city want us to consume and to live through, not the way we want to live and we want to experience the city. It wants to orient us in a particular way. And so what they used to do is that they used to study the everyday patterns of life, how people get up, how people go to work, how people hang out, in what places they hang out, are there places to hang out in a city, what are those places to hang out. And in Delhi, like, and also like Delhi has a lot of parks, but now with the new rich and the middle class, working class, the corporate class population, is usually the malls that become the hanging out places. That's where they usually go, neglecting the public spaces that are available for them to engage with. Or any gated society now has everything in it. You don't even have to go outside. It has gym, it has community centers, all sorts of facility that you are completely gated and isolated within your own premise. So they used to examine the patterns of life, in particular people's use of building and urban space, that how people use the building, how they walk in a building, what kind of stature, what kind of demeanor they carry when they enter into a building. And I think all of us should notice this. And so their research was on what they call as the folk based. It's not like it's individual based, it's subjective based rather than commercially based. And that was not going with the existing ways of looking at urban places. So these kind of sociologies and these kind of new ways of looking at urbanism, it increased heightened awareness of the real social structuring of the city. That this is how city actually is. Please let me know 10 minutes before if when I have to end the first session. I'll do that. So they used to engage with the complex ways in which cities are divided into different quarters. And this we see in Greater Noida and other parts of the cities that are planned and designed, that this is for journalists, this is for IAS officers, civil servants, this is for this particular group of workers and all that stuff. So cities were clustered based on class, occupation or function. They were self-contained, yet reliant on their components in the urban machine, so it functioned like an urban machine. And city planners and administrators were very well aware that cities are subdivided, and indeed that they had to be if they were to function efficiently. But sociology looked at traditional planning, and that had grown up under this rationalist umbrella that looked at city as a machine rather than a living entity, rather than an inclusive inhabiting entity. It reduced the intricacy of the city, structuring into these simple clusters. And Debord wrote a very interesting text called Situationist Thesis on Traffic that was also inspired by an artist we discussed in the previous lecture called Constant, who did this long-term project from the 1950s to the late 1960s called the New Babylon, which was a city that he proposed, a city that is fully automated, where people could not work because people don't have to work because they could then dedicate their time to realize their potential. So everything is taken care by automation. So this was the proposal that city is divided into various sections, various clusters, and every section of the city is self-autonomous, so they can decide what that part of the city wants. So it is not centrally governed, it is decentralized governance. So throughout these decades, Constant continuously built these sculptures, plans, maquettes, sketches, drawings, thinking that this will result into a real urban planning mission. But nobody took up this project. But the Situationists were working closely with Constant, and they were very inspired by these ideas, what Constant was proposing, especially about automation. And automation, as we all know, is very crucial in our times, especially with the arrival of artificial intelligence too, how it is taking over. major chunk of various generative activities, especially related to culture too, picture making, music, sound, editing, everything. So what automation could do and what it also could do to liberate human beings from toiling unnecessarily in work, but realizing their true potential uh, of giving them the chance to do what they want to achieve. So, so as you can also see, there are various ways in the city in which the city's traffic is also divided and managed. So, the board wrote a situationist thesis on traffic, where they also looked at traffic. It should have only one aim. It should not be, because traffic, they also realize, takes up a lot of time for the working class. And that's a time which is usually not added into their salary, into their payment. Commuting is not something that is added into the salary in most places, especially in the lower levels and all. And you need to commute a lot to your workplaces. So for situationist, traffic must have only one aim, that is to bring the other three usefully. That is basically looking at the art, architecture facets of the city and living in the city. But it only has one thing, that it should only be used for joyriding. That you are going outside into the traffic only to experience it in a fun manner, that you are using cars or anything not to commute, not to use it in anything for that kind of matter in a professional manner, that you have to commute for work. It should, you know, all of you have experienced the metro rides, the Uber rides and everything, or the carpooling we take for works. And for situationists, the attempt of all this experience was about joy riding. It should not be for these tedious activities. It should not be about these exhausting activities. Commuting time, even Le Corbusier, one of the great architects who also played a crucial role in building the modern city of Chandigarh, he pointed out, is a surplus labor. It's a labor that we do but never is accounted for. It's a work we do. It's part of the work. And if we can reduce the time, if we can reduce that time, it actually gives a lot of free time to the worker. And from that, the board also deduced that we must replace travel as an adjunct to work with travel as pleasure. And most of the time we relate travel with work, but we are not able to relate travel with work. So these were some of the important propositions which they were making about the ways in which we live the city, and these were utopic proposals about how the city can be imagined. But for that to emerge, that to understand, you have to understand the individual experience of the people who are living. You have to understand the emotional experience of the people who are living there. And both Lefebvre and situationists, they looked at the declaration of, this is an image from the Paris Commune. That was one of the important revolutionary moments of France in the 19th century, where the revolutionaries took over the city and actually they formed a government and they issued a charter of how the city should function with adequate representation of the people. And they had also issued plans for like what kind of art should be made in the city, what kind of cultural activities should be there in the city. So there was a detailed planning of what kind of city they wanted to build. So for them, Paris Commune was an important moment and a situation where ordinary citizens decided to become self-governing. And this is what I said earlier, the right to city is about individual citizens also being part of the self-governing of the city, that they could be part of the governance of the city. The Commune was the biggest festival of the 19th century. The second situationist thesis on the Paris Commune declared, underlying the events of that spring of 1871, one can see the insurgents feeling that they had become masters of their own history, not so much on the level of governmental politics as on the level of their everyday life. So the Paris Commune of 1871 was a radical revolutionary government that briefly ruled Paris from March 18 to May 28, 1871. Emerging in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War and the collapse of the Second French Empire, it was born out of a political discontent of the Second French Empire. It was born out of social inequality and national humiliation. So the origins of the communes were deeply rooted in the socio-political upheavals of the 19th century, and there were the tensions between the working class and the ruling elites were increased by economic hardship and the perceived failures of the French government to protect national interests during the war. So the Commune represented a bold attempt to establish a socialist government that emphasized the principles of decentralization, direct democracy, and workers' control over production. So this was an important inspiration for the Situationists, and especially the aspect of art and urbanism, how Paris Commune looked at it. And it was deeply intertwined with the cultural artistic milieu of that time, where many artists and intellectuals actively supported and participated in the Paris Commune. The Commune's vision for art was revolutionary, emphasizing the democratization of culture and the empowerment of artists as agents of social change. And in terms of urban policy, the Commune's legacy can be seen in its critique of the existing urban fabric of Paris, which had been dramatically reshaped by Baron Haussmann's renovations under Napoleon III. The Commune opposed the authoritarian and top-down approach of Haussmannization, and they advocated that instead for urban spaces that they were more responsive to the needs and aspirations of the ordinary Paris citizens. So this included the promotion of communal spaces and the envisioning of a city as an organized city around the principles of social equality and participatory governance. So these are some of the founding principles of psychogeography, that a city's character, city's mapping should also be framed by people's experience. And that is what psychogeography as a study is, psychogeography as a practice is. It is a field of study which examines the interrelation between geography and psychology through the interrelation between space and human beings. And I want to quickly show you um, some works, not works, like examples by two important artists, like two young artists who I know, who work with the psychogeographic method, who always go around to explore the landscape and represent it in their practice. And walking becomes an important activity in psychogeography, that you walk in the city, you walk in the landscape and map, note down those experiences. And noting down doesn't mean that you always have to write. Like Vasudha Toru did in our exhibition, she always went out with a sketchbook and she drew those experiences of how to navigate in the city. What was the experience of being in a city? So this is Himani Gupta's examination, or a psychogeographic examination that she's still continuing in her practice. The second one is Arindam Manna, who was a student, former student of mine, still practicing and very interestingly practicing. His practice still focuses on the Grand Trunk Road, the historical road that stretches from the central part of India till here. So he looks at the history, not only the history of that road, but the various experiences of the migrants who go through that road, travelers who go through that road. So their experiences, how time is understood, because you always have to, like there are a lot of trucks, carriers and all that move through that space. So how does that determine the conditions of the working class around those spaces? So his artworks are also in kind of inspired by the psychogeography, the emotional geography of the Grand Trunk Road, that is a long road. So these are some of the examples which I wanted to show you to say that so psychogeography is about the interaction between body, landscape and the urban spaces. And it's the artworks that come out of it is a representation of that interaction. And a lot of artists are using this framework to work, especially to understand what happens to the body when it comes to contact with the urban system or a city, and what happens to the body when it comes to a spatial context, a spatial context that is very hegemonic, that is very controlling over the body, that it dictates each aspects of how you should move, how you should navigate through the city, what happens to that particular body when it is told to do so, when it is ordered to do so indirectly. So nobody tells you to take these pathways. Nobody asks you to go and open up your like what you call, open up your bag. You get frisked because you know that you are going to be frisked. You need to remove your things because you need to do that. So there are a lot of ways in which we obey. Our bodies obey automatically, or our bodies behave automatically in the environments around us. And without us realizing that, we are slowly adapted to it. So these body contacts with urban spaces and with other subjects and objects. What happens to us, like when we see the people who are begging on the streets, people who are working on the streets, what is our response to that? Manual scavengers, how do we respond to that? Why are like manual scavengers not visible in the daytime? Why do they have to come in the early part of the day, do their work and leave before the sunrise? Why are they invisible? So it's also about body's response to the different subjects that exist within the city. And this contact is shaped through, on the one hand, with spatial hierarchy, and on the other hand, with the sociological and psychological factors that shape us. So certain questions which I would like to share with you when you are engaging with a psychogeographic practice is that what is the nature of gap between physical and psychological maps? Because when you look at the map of Kolkata, or if you're a tourist, you come, you carry a lonely planet or something like that when you're visiting Kolkata. Now, you know that there are certain monuments and important eateries that are listed on these places. Even the city government also gives you that. But you know that it's a selection that is made officially, which means that there are a lot of omissions also that are made. There are a lot of places that the city does not, or the official city does not want you to look at. There are a lot of monuments that are listed, but there are a lot of monuments that the city does not want you to look at, which the French philosopher Rancière calls as the police version of the history. That police always tell you, jahan pe crime scene hai, they always tell you that don't look there, don't go there. But that is where the crime scene is. That's where the real crime has happened. So that's the police version of history. It does not always, it always tell you to not look at the right place. It always misdirect you somewhere else. So city also does that. The city maps also does that when it represents what city monuments are, what city's memories are. And one artist who I really liked and interacted with is the Swiss artist Thomas Hirschhorn, who works extensively to build these memorials and monuments. Because every city has memorials and monuments. And what Thomas Hirschhorn does is, he goes around the city and he identifies a place and he says that I want to build a monument for my favorite writer and philosopher. I like Antonio Gramsci, I like Walter Benjamin, I like Hannah Arendt. I want to build a monument here. Now you have to help me. So he goes to the community. He is not even telling that I will help you build a monument which you want. So there's an interesting engagement that goes, and this is a Gramsci monument which he built in the black neighborhood. So usually if you're going to a black neighborhood with an artistic project, you will say, okay, let's build a monument for Martin Luther, Malcolm X, or somebody like Rosa Parks, or somebody like that. What he says is that he's building a monument for an Italian Marxist who he likes. And there are many monuments like that he built. Now there are a lot of debates, discussions that happens with the community. And what through and through Thomas Hirschhorn also emphasizes that this is what I love and please help me build it. This is, as an artist, I am the artist. This is my vision and I want this to be realized, and how can you help me? And through various negotiations, discussions and all, they come up with these interesting monuments that uses this kind of industrial materials, abandoned wood scraps and everything, and they build these kind of makeshift monuments that carries reading rooms in it, cooking spaces, performance spaces and everything. It's a whole microsystem in itself. It has everything to kind of engage into in a intellectual activity, cultural activity. So there are daily lectures that take place in these spaces. People can attend them for free. People can take part in music classes, dance classes, and also it becomes an alternative center of education and culture in itself that the city could not build for the marginalized community, but it is now built with an artistic vision along with the community, for the community. So these are monuments which what you call, many Thomas Hirschhorn has built, but these questions how about the rationality of the mapping, what kind of mapping we have in the city. So I'll just quickly show you some images of these projects of Thomas Hirschhorn. These are various monuments that he has built for his favorite poets and philosophers. And one important project for me is also this one. There's a crystal quilt that's by Suzanne Lazy, where on the Mother's Day, these 430 women over the age of 60, they performed an hour-long tableau where they would sit around these tables and they talk about their experiences as like what all they did for the family, what kind of experience they do. So four people will sit together, then they will talk, then they will move to the next table, and it went on for this long time. And by the end of it, it became into an experience where they all came together, realizing what as women they collectively went through. So creating platforms in the city, creating community experiences in the city for various kind of disabled and marginalized, disenfranchised of the city is what psychogeography does. So it's not only about like you just wander around and you experience this emotion, that emotion. It's not only about that. It's about unpacking certain problems in the way in which our cities are functioning right now, the way our cities are planned right now. And that is what psychogeography allows us to do. So thank you. So this is quickly the first part of the lecture. We'll also continue after a short break. I'll just continue with the previous image. So this is the group image, the pictures that were taken during the earlier project. So you can see the happiness in the face, the relief, the experience they had together by sharing their stories, coming together. But the key factor here was again creating a space for a certain age group, demography, who is always again undermined in cities planning, who we don't create spaces for to commune, to come together, to do something, to create something or be together. So this is again gives us an idea about how to reimagine the public spaces in the city itself, but what kind of spaces we have created for our citizens. Now, when I talk to you about that, we have to use bodies into spaces. But when we ask this question or when we do this practice, we need to ask certain questions also that how can we place the body into the space? What does this mean? That how can you place the body into the space? How does the body move through space? And what does or should this movement mean to the one who examines the designs of the urban space? So this is about the knowledge of the walking body that is moving from one place to another, and that is the important method of the psychogeography as a discipline. So you have to reposition the walking body into the urban space. So we take a body, for example, from outer space or literally from air, and let's assume that we put it into a spot on Earth. Starting from this spot, the body would move and stop on several points within an imaginary path, acting similarly to the arrows, Zenon's famous arrows. So the body would create a lacework of roots within within like its own nodes and traces through a dialectical, rhythmic, and spatial experience of the urban daily life, acting similar to slugs, which can be monitored by an attentive urban voyager from the bird's eye's view. So this imaginary urban voyager or urban analyst would recognize a pattern of this movement. The contact of body to and at space would leave these kind of readable traces. So body reacts to different spatial patterns in different ways. And these reactions lead us to different sort of experiences. And this also helps us to understand that how the place is designed and constructed with respect to technical codes and policies. So this is basically what the gist of the first lecture is, that we need to map urban spaces emotionally. And to map urban spaces in an emotional manner, it means that one must incorporate psychogeographic principles, and that also emphasizes the exploration of urban environments based on emotional and psychological responses rather than only looking at the spatial efficiency. I come to the next part, the second part of the lecture, that is cultivating connections. And this is an important part of the contemporary art, that we need to build connections with the community. And with the emergence and rise of community practices, where art is entering into the everyday life, art is entering into the public spaces and not also into the community, also into the lived spaces. We see the resurgence of uh, a practice that is rooted in communication. And the medium here is communication, that you go to a community, you interact with the community, like what I told you about Thomas Hershaw. The communication there is sometimes tense. It is not only always amicable, it's not only friendly all the times, but it is also very antagonistic. Because Thomas Hershaw is one of those rare artists who always emphasize on the autonomy of the artist, which is very rare to see in contemporary art. He does not adhere to the communitarian spirit. He says that I am an autonomous artist and you will have to help me. This is what I want. And whereas in many places community practices have also developed an appeasement sensibility towards the community. Sometimes it also serves a utilitarian perspective towards community's needs and desires. So there are various ways in which art functions with community. But what is important on all these practices is that communication becomes the key. Communication becomes the medium through which you engage with the community. That becomes your material and the medium. Nothing else matters here. Communication becomes the bedrock of these practices and research. So when you look at the contemporary art methodology that looks at these kind of socially engaged practices, it has a long history throughout the 20th century. So various artistic movements like Dadas, the Situationist Internationals, the community arts movement, all use various kind of processes for engaging people, like what we see in this image also. They use different methods to engage people, to interact with people, using communities as a key part of their practice. And in recent years, the concept is promoted again and reframed as participatory art by Nicolas Bourriat, the French writer, philosopher, who has wrote this very interesting book. If you haven't read, it's called The Relational Aesthetics, where he looks at all the practices as relational, that it depends on the social relations, and our attempt should be to break those social relations. For example, there are existing social relations that exist around us: father, son, teacher, student, those hierarchical relations that are set. And the task of situationist art practice and participatory art practice is to create new relations where these hierarchies break, create new situations, create new practices where these hierarchies break, is what relational aesthetics and relational participatory practice aspires to be. So you must have seen a lot of artists serving food, a lot of artists cooking food and serving it to visitors. That's now become a recent trend in India. But there's an artist who practices it and has popularized it abroad called Rirke Tirwania, who was the one who has kind of created this new art practice of cooking food, serving food, or doing haircut for people who require that. But in all that, what Rirkit and others are trying to do is to offer their service. But we also have to understand that it is an unsolicited service. Nobody has asked that I want that. We are offering an unsolicited service. And the problem with that is that you have not understood the requirement of the audience or the visitors. And this is my biggest problem with contemporary curating and contemporary institutions, is that we always undermine the audience. We think that audience will be happy with this. Audience want this, but never forget that art exhibitions are the knot which we tie together with art, space, and audience. And audience are a crucial factor in this.
So a lot of these practices actually take audience for granted. But what we need to develop is a practice that is developed, that is founded on the principles of interaction and communication. So there are various ways in which these practices are now studied, looked upon. They have critiques of community practices, they have appreciations of community practices, and you will see many examples of those kind of practices. But one important practice which is not exactly communitarian in that way in which we understand a community practice, but something which is very important in terms of useful for the community is, for me, is this one. By the conceptual artist Hans Hake. It's a very interesting project which he did, a very important project which he did called Shapolsky and Others Manhattan Real Estate Holdings, a real-time social system as of May 1, 1971. It's a long-term project which he did. So it basically chronicles the fraudulent activities of one of New York's largest slumlords, that's the Shapolsky and other, the Manhattan Real Estate Holdings. So the work comprises of almost 146 photographs of Manhattan apartment buildings, mostly these are tenements, maps of Harlem and the Lower East Side, photographs and charts documenting real estate transactions, and text with information about the location and ownership structure and financial histories of the buildings. So basically, Hans Hake went into this detailed research, went into these buildings, and he not only looked at the buildings, he looked at the custody of these buildings. He looked at who owned these buildings, what were the tax systems, the rent systems that are in place in these places. What is ownership in these places, and who is buying it, who is selling it, and how the real estate is manipulated in these areas. And the work exposed the properties and transactions of Shapolsky and others, Manhattan Real Estate Holdings, which in 1907 represented the biggest concentration of real estate in New York under one group, and it is still an active corporation today. The properties of the group were found primarily in the Lower East Side and Harlem, that are the two neighborhoods characterized by their ethnic and racial minorities. So this was the long work which Hake did that does not qualify exactly as an artwork. It's more, it usually belongs in what we term as a photojournalistic kind of work or investigative journalistic work. But here is an artist who is undertaking that work and exposing the findings in an art exhibition. And there's a very interesting history about this art exhibition because this was part of Hake's individual exhibition that was programmed for 1971 at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And Thomas Messer, who was also the director of the museum, they called Shapolsky and others inadequate and refused it along with two other works, judging them incompatible with the functions of an artistic institution. So the exhibition was cancelled a month and a half before its scheduled date. When the artist refused to remove these three works, the curator of the exhibition defended the works and was subsequently fired. So when we are talking about community practice, many times this was also what I was discussing in the panel discussion today, that we need to also blur this certain conventional understandings of what is public art, that public art always has to be in a public space. That as you have seen, this is very much a public art. In that way, this impacts the lives of people. It exposes the real estate mafia of that place. And it's shown in a gallery. So does it mean that it's not public art? And works like this is Christophe Woodisco's Homeless Vehicle, where he created, it's a what you call, it's a satirical take, it's a satirical pod. It's a homeless vehicle, and as you know that US has one of the largest homeless population, especially in the most financially rich areas. And what Woodisco used to do is that he used to take around these pods, especially through the financial capital of Manhattan, New York, and all these areas, and it drew attention towards the crisis of urban spaces, the crisis of the housing system in USA. So there are projects like this that also exist that talks about the urban crisis, that talks about the problems of the community. So the philosophy and theory of cultivating connections in urban settings are deeply rooted in the belief that cities thrive not just on their infrastructure and economic activities, but also on the intricate social and cultural networks that bind communities together. So it's not only about infrastructure, it's not only about the economic activities of the city, like you see here, but it's about those intricate social and cultural networks cities build around us. And drawing inspiration from the the writer researcher on architecture and um, urbanism, Jane Jacobs, uh, who championed the importance of social interactions in urban life. This philosophy emphasizes the role of human relationships in creating vibrant and inclusive communities. And this is also very much relevant and related to what I talked to you about, the right to the city itself, Henry Lefebvre's idea of the right to the city. This also aligns with the ideas of participatory urbanism, where collective agency is paramount and community members actively engage in decision-making process. The concept also intersects with the practice of placemaking, as I discussed earlier, a movement advocating for designing spaces that prioritize human well-being and foster community spirit. So social theorists like Michel Foucault has provided insights into the power dynamics at play in urban environments, urging us to consider how spaces can either divide or unite people based on how power is distributed and exercised. And what we see increasingly in new cities is how the spaces divide us more than it unite us. And it also replicates, the urban spaces also replicate the work culture, the corporate work culture and everything, where the workers are more and more alienated, the workers are more and more clustered, so they can't interact with each other. They can't form unions, friendships, bondings with each other. The idea is to always keep them alienated from each other. And that's the idea with the urban spaces too, how they are planned and how they are designed. So in India, Jane Jacobs is not widely recognized among mainstream planners, who often dismiss her because she has no formal training in the field of architecture and urban planning as such. But her emphasis on prioritizing people over centralized decision making is often overlooked by governments and policymakers. And this critique, where she is, you can read that, highlights also about the Indian planning system. It's despite lacking an architecture degree, Jacobs gained her insight from real life experiences on the streets and through her active engagement in urban community battles. Her dedication to New York City reflects her belief in cities as places for building community and fostering connection. And Robert Morse is one of the important architects and a big powerhouse. There's a book on him called The Powerhouse itself. Was an important architect of the New York City and New York, uh, uh, who was a prominent planner, who's known for these large-scale urban projects. And it's also very important because Robert Moses designed all those cities despite being elected or being appointed as somebody in a constitutional capacity. So he enjoyed unlimited power, money to design cities, and later on it was exposed in this book, I think it's called The Power Broker itself. Uh, it's a Pulitzer Prize winning book, so it's not some kind of conspiracy book, where he is exposed as having these huge links with the real estate mafia. And that these projects, large scale projects, were always created to get more funds from the government and to control the real estate of these places. And Moses called Jane Jacobs that she's merely a housewife, that she does not know anything about the architecture or anything modern architecture. But Jacobs is very well known for effectively organizing community resistance that halted many of Robert Moses's plans. And one of the important books that she has written, you all should read, is it's called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which is now being widely read and celebrated by planners, architects, urban designers across the world. So Jane Jacobs challenged the urban planning norms of her time by emphasizing everyday life in the city, such as which streets are paved and why some parks thrive while others do not. So cities, you also should understand that cities have parks for every places, every clusters. But why some parks get more attention, why some parks get more maintenance than other parks, while some roads get more maintenance than other roads, while some areas get more attention than other places. And this is what she used to observe and write and talk about. And her approach is also very relevant to our cities, where top down planning often overlooks the needs of ordinary people. For example, in Mumbai, the Slum Redevelopment Authority and large infrastructure initiatives like flyovers and the coastal road prioritizes certain interests over public transport and public needs, often failing to increase the mobility of the city's vast population. Jacobs focused on the lived experiences of the city, and her book captures this details vividly. And as she says, cities are an immense laboratory of trial and error, failure and success in city building and city design. But the problem is that most of our cities are modeled upon towns, suburbs, tuberculosis sanatoria, or fairs or imaginary dream cities. Nobody imagines a city to be an inclusive city that could be livable. And she also highlighted how planned housing developments segregate people. To house people in this planned fashion, price tags are fastened on the population, and each sorted out chunk of price tag populaces lives in growing suspicion and tension against the surrounding city. So Jacob's work underscores the significance of community-focused urban design that takes into account where people walk, play, socialize, advocating for a cityscape that reflects and supports the daily lives of its inhabitants rather than adhering to detached authoritarian planning principles. And we build a lot of cities, we plan a lot of cities. What is, for me, one of the fundamental lifelines of a city is the street dwellers, the hawkers, the vendors who sit on the pavements and sell their stuff. And it's an important part of the middle class, lower class economy of the city. But when we plan even the pavements, we don't plan it in such a way that these people can also host their shops, host their commodities and sell. We don't create such spaces. We always create the pavements in such a way that it can be walked by the pedestrians, and most of the time it's also overtaken by the shops or the vehicles. But what if we also build spaces for these players who are also as important as all the important malls and everything, the people who live in the city? This is where the urban planning in India and anywhere else also is far away from the realities. That it does not build or it does not sustain the lifeline of the city. It does not encourage the lifelines of the city. So I'll quickly go to certain interesting projects across the world. One is this one called Face Your World. This is in Amsterdam, where this artist group organizes this weekly neighborhood presentations where you could meet your neighbors, which is very difficult in cities. And it's very difficult and more difficult when your neighbors are refugees. You don't want to do that. You're scared to do that. You have a lot of perceptions and stereotypical perceptions about these people. So what this artist group does is they usually, in every week, they do these neighborhood presentations where you meet your neighbor, you interact with them, you play with the kids, and you also eat together with them. And through that, you get to know your community, you get to know your neighborhood, and you integrate with the community. So this is an interesting example for me about community building exercise within the city. The second is the Oda Projesi. This is from Turkey. It's also an artist group who engages with the historic Istanbul city, the monuments and everything. And what they usually do is that they do these picnics in different parts of the historic they select one historic monument and they take all the neighbors together there. They sit and they invite an art historian or they invite a historian, an archaeologist who is an expert in that field, who could talk about that field, and they eat together, they discuss about the place, so it gives also a better understanding of that place. And through that, they get to know about the historical relevance, the architectural relevance of each monument of the city. This is a project called The Flavors of Glenroy, it's written there. This happened in Victoria, where the local residents focused on cultivating edible plants together. So the artist group came together because Australia, as you know, is always criticized for its macho-ness, ugliness and everything. And they wanted to change that perception by building an inclusive community practice that also fosters on building something together, planting something together for the neighborhood. So unlike other projects that also centers around cooking, what the Flavors of Glenroy did was it emphasized on growing food to connect people. So it was not about cooking here. It was about growing food itself to connect people. And it was also celebrating the diversity of food practices of the region. So they selected edible plants that could be planted in the edible garden that also belonged to that particular region, which was part of the diet of different communities of that region. So this initiative aimed to address the decreasing physical engagement in public urban spaces due to technological connections, and it fostered a sense of community for them by encouraging conversations around gardening. So the Flavors of Glenroy is a participatory project where you use public art to connect local communities through the universal theme of food by cultivating edible plants. And as an artist curator, the project's leader focused on curating inclusive cities, drawing on the Latin origin of the term curate. The word curate comes from the Latin words curare. Latin word curare, the root word is curare, where curare comes again, leads to it etymologically, it is linked with the word cure in English. It means to heal. So curator in Latin is also a physician, as much as they deal with art. So, but the primary role of the curator is to heal, to take care of something. So in this project, they went into that original meaning of the word curator, who is also a healer, who takes care on behalf of the community. So here they are planting food. They are planting edible plants that can be used by the community for for nurturing urban sites and creating new relationships between the neighbors. But why are we talking all these things? So I was looking at the inclusive city framework that was drafted by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs in 2021. And Kunal Kumar, who was the joint secretary at that time, who was also the mission director of smart cities, he says that urban living is complex and exclusion of the marginalized demographics increases the complexities for them further. Smart cities have the potential both to change our cities for the better, or it can also reinforce existing inequalities. As such, Smart City Mission intends to redevelop the existing areas, create livelihood for locals, and develop new areas. The inclusive framework will come in handy as a ready reckoner for inclusion in both sectoral as well as pan-city projects. So this report was basically operating through an inclusive city framework, that the cities have to be more inclusive. and one has to apply an inclusive city framework in the development of the cities. So Hitesh Vaidya, who is the director of the National Institute of Urban Affairs, he says that the dynamics of the city demographics is changing every day. By 2050, India will have the largest percentage of elderly population, with an active number engaged in the workforce. They have identified 21 types of disabilities that are listed in the rights of persons, and uh, and including women and children who so the people with disabilities, that means different kind of disabilities, women and children. So they are identified as the vulnerable group in the report, and their plan is the proposition is to make cities more inclusive for these demography. So it is estimated that about 25% of the population need universal access. And it is essential for now for the cities to realize and be more congruent to the needs of these demographic groups. Ensuring cities are inclusive is not always an easy task. It requires city planning and design to be conceived with inclusion as a number one priority. The Inclusive City Framework has been prepared as the comprehensive document to provide all inclusive provisions for housing and infrastructure development. So modern cities are convenient and enjoyable places for living and working. There's no doubt about that. But these kind of designed urban environments are also filled with latent uncertainties, hidden anxieties, and potential dangers for vulnerable groups of people. And these groups encounter several obstacles which prevent them from moving freely and safely in urban environments, thereby causing social and economic segregation, and finally self-withdrawal. In India itself, 25% of the population is estimated to need universal accessibility to live independently and with dignity, and house the largest number of elderly population in the world that will grow 20% more by 2050. So urban inclusiveness means participation, appropriation, and creation of value. So in conclusion, as cities are expanding, traditional governance models that were used by and that is still used by public planners and administrators are inadequate to address the rapid pace of urban change. For cities to thrive and foster vibrant public life, civic participation and community involvement are essential. Merely designing a space is insufficient for creating meaningful places or improving urban environments. Effective urban planning must engage citizens and involve them in decision-making processes, as the mere aesthetic appeal of urban spaces does not ensure successful regeneration. Policymakers need to avoid creating a false sense of place and should instead focus on participation and urban governance, emphasizing identities, values, and images that can influence behavior and shape spaces. Urban planning should be seen as an evolving process that allows inhabitants to recognize their identities and align growth with an evolving sense of meaning. Now, I end with an important question that do we need more community participation or do we need more public art? Now, community participation is now a key expectation in urban regeneration, with public art is recognized as a valuable tool for facilitating that. Public art, because of its collaborative and dynamic nature, fosters relationships among residents and between residents and other social actors, forming a foundation for sustainable planning. Public art processes engage inhabitants from the beginning, using analysis and dialogue to build on shared values and commitments, which enhances motivation. The emotional aspect of these interactions further strengthens the involvement, making the urban planning process more effective. So the lecture addresses a crucial question: can urban regeneration and citizen participation truly be the primary goals of public art? Or does public art risk losing its alternative and radical nature by becoming subsumed into institutional and urban planning? And we see the effects of public art getting subsumed into urban planning When you look at the Delhi urban planning public projects, where it becomes empty gestures of commissioning sculptures and putting it into different parks, where people like wake up one day, go for a walk, and they see these sculptures who they no connection with. So it should it be like that, or should it challenge the formal regulations that exist? It raised concerns about the potential exploitation of public art programs by policymakers. So public art programs also need to balance or find a balance between urban planners and the desires of the inhabitants of the city. It should ensure equal opportunities for challenging the establishment and avoiding exploitation. When public art focuses on participatory design, social responsibility, active citizenship, and relationship building, it becomes a valuable tool for community planning. Public art can serve as an innovative governance instrument if it triggers participatory mechanisms involving various urban actors, both individual and collective, to enhance public space quality. It allows central and local governments to engage with citizens and address their social demands for urban quality effectively. So that's the kind of public art and placemaking I propose through these lectures. Thank you.
Do we have questions? Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. Hi. This was. So, my question isn't actually a question, it's more of a takeaway or an observation. Uh, can we actually consider, like, as you said before, when or space becoming a place, right? So, there is an alignment with respect to identity, interpersonal and social and individual identity. So, can there be a transmutation of both, as in identity as space and space as identity? I mean, space or anything has to evolve into, let's say, a domicile or a place of residence, to say the least. So it actually contributes to a sense of identity for that concerned individual or a group of individuals. So that's my that's my observation. So we can relate the two, right? I mean, does it make sense?
No, it makes sense, but many times what happens is that we overlap these terms very frequently without acknowledging the distinctions they carry. For example, space becomes physical space, for that matter. That gets endlessly reproduced in the global capital. So if you look at, there are various series or photographic series now. So you are a photographer. So you know on empty malls, empty housing complexes in China, in various parts of India like Noida, Gurgaon, that are built, that are abandoned, or that were once built, that are abandoned. Capitalism thrives through this production of space. It creates space, it moves on, it abandons that, it creates another space, it moves on. And all these spaces carry a homogeneous character to it. They don't carry an identity, they carry a certain homogenized character of neutrality, that everybody belongs to it. And in that, what gets subsumed is the individual identities, communitarian identities, beliefs or belonging, ways of living and everything. These spaces just become a ground to gather rather than to belong. So I distinguish place from space merely because of this factor that space allows us to inhabit, allows us to be there, but place allows us to belong. Place gives us a home. Place gives us the identity that allows us to cherish the identities and values which we carry. That's why the differentiation is crucial for me.
Thank you.
Yeah, do we have more questions, observations, or responses? Yeah.
Thank you so much for the excellent lecture. There were a lot of examples that were shown from outside of the Indian context, and you did mention some of the things that are within the Indian context. But what are the various ways that we can break down those existing relationships? I know it's not very simple to look at that, but are there any examples that you could give within the Indian cultural context? Thank you.
Um, there are various groups within India. I usually don't give examples from India for the reason because they are too familiar. And it becomes easy for everyone to relate to that and not relate it with what's happening generally outside the world. Um, One of the important examples for me is the Mumbai-based group called Open Circle. And Open Circle is again a group of artists, architects, designers, and mainly comprising of artists who did artistic interventions about how Mumbai was getting imagined as the next Shanghai at that time in the 90s and 2000s. So one important artist who was part of that, a dear friend of ours who is no more, Tushar Jog, who I used to teach with him at the Shivnada University. So Tushar, because that was a time when there was this entire announcement of Mumbai becoming the next Shanghai. And so what Tushar used to do is that because there were a lot of, what is the term for removing people uh, from one area, from slums and all, what is that term? Relocation. It was forceful relocation actually, you're removing them from those places. But they don't value or they don't get the news attention. We see them as normalized things. So what Tushar did was that he printed these fake government notices saying that this area, he used to go to flats where these rich and middle class people used to live, and he used to print these letters in the government format with the seal and everything. And it was a seal of a fake corporate house that's called Unicell. That's what a fictional corporate entity he has created, and they undertake different tasks. So this was one of them, urban development and relocation and everything. So he used to go to these urban houses, flats and everything, and he used to leave those letters at the houses saying that this area is going to be redeveloped. We are making Mumbai as Shanghai, so you all are going to be relocated. Then people used to panic. And they would try to see who has come, which government officer or this guy has come to distribute these letters and everything. But it creates that panic, that feeling, at least that what others were feeling when they were really getting relocated. And there were a lot of projects like that which they did to question how Mumbai was developing, and some of them was also happened in public spaces to question, and they also worked together with architects to also enhance the lives of people in the slums. So Tushar's partner Sharmila, they used to create these school bags for the kids. So those are simple school bags, but when you go back home, there are poles attached to it. So there are foldable poles, so you can take it and make it stand and use it as a table. So they used to work with the community and create those things that were required for the urban poor. So a lot of such things, projects they had done, and that was a project that has actively intervened in city. The next group and the institution that has worked extensively on city is, for me, is the CSDS that is in Delhi, and they had a project called Sarai. And Sarai has been doing a series of research-based interventions in Delhi city, uh, uh, looking at how the Delhi city was transformed from 90s to 2000, what all important changes happened, but not only architecturally, but what all fears grew in the city with the rise of Monkey Man and all these things like where are these fears coming from? This fear was also about the other who was entering into the city, the migrant workers who were entering into the city. Uh, but how the city was changing. So Sarai has various projects that look at the ways in which Delhi's architecture, Delhi's social life, Delhi's urban fabric changed from 90s to 2000, and technological factors also changed from 90s to 2000. And Sarai's projects were also led by one of the important contemporary artist groups of India called Rux Media. And they have again intervened actively in the technological lives of Delhi's and India's urbanism. So these are two important groups that I could relate to. And one of the important projects I was part of was, which I did not show here, is the Bhubaneswar Art Trail. I curated along with Jagannath Panda that we did in the old town of Bhubaneswar. That's a strange complex of 8th century AD temples, 19th century mutts, and 20th, 21st century housing complexes all stitched together in this congested area. And we did a public art project there, but I'm not interested in the public art project, but rather than that I was interested in the 1 year long community activities we started before entering into the public art. So the volunteers and the team members, they used to go and visit every house and tell them that this is the project that's used to happen, and they used to invite them for meetings to come and attend the meeting, that this is the kind of public art project that's going to happen here. So these are some of the issues which we are going to talk about. So the project engaged with community like no other public art project. And it was so beautiful that our lunch and dinner were hosted at a place we did not have to seek out for spaces outside anywhere. Everything was provided for us, and we displayed artworks within temples, both were temples in worship and abandoned temples. We displayed artworks in the backyards of people's houses, in the flats, apartments of people. Um, we removed almost 20 truckloads of waste from a common dumping yard and filled that with soil and kind of created a common gathering area for people. We painted the entire walls of that street. So for me, more than the production and the final output, these activities that benefited the community was more important for us. So there are these some of examples that kind of revived community and engaged with community more closely for me from the Indian context.
Yeah, do we have more questions? Yeah.
My question is in relation to what you told about the psychogeographical method. So, you talked about the centrality of the body in these experiences of using these methods. And what I can immediately think of is Lefebvre's idea of rhythm analysis, where he talks about body being central. But in terms of using these ideas, like, can you just flesh a little bit, like, this idea of how to use this, or what impact it has on knowledge production, or any kind of like some examples, or just can you just expand a little on this?
Are you an artist?
No, I'm an ethnographer. Like, I'm a researcher, so.
There's a very interesting painting I would like to take a look at. It's called The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fogs by Caspar Friedrich. Caspar David Friedrich, Austrian painter. So it's a very important painting, very popular painting, Wanderer Above the Sea of Fogs. But this figure of the wanderer was very important for the German Austrian intellectual tradition for a long time, including Nietzsche. And for Nietzsche, philosopher should be like a wanderer, that they should be away from the mainstream society. They wander away to the summit. So there's also the idea of the aerial view. So even if you look at that painting, the wanderer is standing above the mountain. They are engulfed by the sea of fog, but they are standing on a summit. And throughout 19th century, many intellectuals, German philosophers are all went on this walk, wandering, and wandering emerged as an important activity for them to experience the world outside the normal mainstream world. And Nietzsche himself used to practice this very often. He used to go on these retreats and get up in the early morning, drink 1 or 2 glass of milk, go for these long walks, come back, sit down, write. Again in the evenings he will go for the walk, come back and write. This is what he used to do. So the idea of wanderer as a figure is something that is contrary to the stable idea of living in some place. And this was then further modified by the French flaneurs, who also went around walking, and that then became an important study on French modern urbanism and also German modern urbanism too. The early responses to what urban spaces look like emerged from how the flaneurs walked around the city. So the idea was to walk around, and the situationists also developed a method called detourment or derive, where they used to go from one place to another. So flaneur usually used to walk, they used to observe the city, they come back and write or reflect on their responses. Derive or detourment was about hopping from place to place. And it was not very formal, it was casual, that you could hop from a bar, a cafe to cafe, a bar to bar, drink, gather around with friends, and use that experience to build on, understand what kind of emotional mappings can be created by the city. So there are various ways to map the city, and I'm not romanticizing the idea of walking, because as bodies we have functional diversity. Each body is different. Each body has pain. Each body is, sometimes bodies are disabled. Sometimes bodies are not fully capable in that way. So we also have to understand the limitations or the restrictions the bodies carry. But walking is an integral aspect of this, and please read this book called The Philosophy of Walking, where it's also listed. It's a French book, but now translated to English. Very important book on the philosophy of walking itself, why walking is crucial compared to running, jogging, and all other kind of activities. What does walking attain? What does body respond to when you're walking, and how walking has been an important philosophical activity for from the 19th century onwards in European history and even in this part of the world too. So that's what I would like to say.
Yeah, do we have more questions? Yeah.
Since we don't have any more questions, so we will be ending the event. So, thank you everyone for joining us today. And to conclude, I would just want to extend my invitation to the KKCL exhibition, which this lecture is a part of. So, please visit Kaee Contemporary, and you can have a grasp, a better knowledge of the entire curation. Thank you all.
Thank you everyone, and thank you Richa. Thank you everyone at KCC for hosting, documenting, organizing everything for this lecture generously. Thanks a lot.